So I want to invite you to return to the question I asked you earlier in our service. How do you like to give? And I'd like for you to think about maybe the last time that you can remember giving in a way that felt meaningful or significant. And when you drop back into this moment, imagine yourself offering your resources or your time or your expertise. What do you notice? Are there specific feelings? Is there a tangible emotion emanating from the receiver of the gift? Does it change your relationship or your dynamic with the person on the other end of your giving? And I really want to give us a brief moment here to really try to connect with whatever emotions or memories or even values that feel alive as you picture this recent experience of giving. And it's from this headspace that I would like to begin to explore this week's Torah portion of Truma. So I'm going to start by sharing something that might be surprising coming from a rabbi delivering a Devar Torah, but here it is. At first glance, this week's Parsha is not exactly a page-turner. And just to make it clear that I'm not making some sort of attention-grabbing radical statement, I'm going to anonymously quote two different drashot I read about Truma this week. In one I read, and this is a quote, "I can't say that this week's Parsha, Truma, keeps us on the edge of our seats. It has even been described as arguably the most boring section in the whole Bible." And in another, and I can't emphasize this enough, this is a direct quote, "Truma, let's be honest, might be the least exciting read in the whole Torah." So who's fired up about tonight's drash? For those of you who did have a chance to read this week's Torah portion before you arrived tonight, you likely have some understanding of why this is the case, because more than anything else, Parshat Truma reads most closely to a set of IKEA instructions. Over not only the next few chapters, but also the next few weeks of our Torah reading cycle, we will read in excruciating detail about the Mishkan, the tabernacle, that the Israelites are tasked to build in order to be able to worship and enter into deeper relationship with the divine presence. And so for the majority of Parshat Truma, we are reading about materials like acacia wood and gold and dolphin skins, and very specific dimensions that are described in handbreadths and cubits, and important aesthetic designs for the kruvim and the menorah and the curtains. It's a Torah portion full of details. But just before this exhaustive list begins, we read this verse. Ve'asuli mikdash ve'shachanti betocham. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. And even a first pass at this verse might not glean very much. It would be easy to view this as a header or a title for our IKEA package, instructions on how to build a tabernacle. But if we begin to look more closely, we see that something much more profound is taking place. And in breaking down this verse, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory explains that the key word here is the verb shin chaf nun, shachan, to dwell. And Rabbi Sachs explains that this key word here had never been used in connection with God. In fact, it eventually became a key word of Judaism itself, because from it came the word mishkan, meaning sanctuary, and Shekhinah, the divine presence. And central to the meaning of this word is the idea of closeness. What Rabbi Sachs is emphasizing for us is that God is directly telling Moses and the Israelites that this tabernacle is not simply meant to be a place of worship for them, and it's not meant to be a shrine honoring God, but it's meant to be an opportunity for God and the people to draw nearer to one another. That this Mishkan can actually serve as a container for greater intimacy and connection between God and the Israelites. But it's not just that God wants to shachan, wants to dwell among the Israelites, but it's that God wants to dwell betocham. And JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, translates this as that I may dwell among them. But the Or HaChaim is among many commentators that points out that this is actually not what the Hebrew is saying. This prefix be, it does not mean among, but it actually means in or within. And he goes to point out that the verse does not state that I may dwell within it, within the Mishkan, but rather that I may dwell within them, the people themselves. Whether this is meant to be understood literally or figuratively, what is obvious is that God is yearning for such a deep connection that the lines are blurred between where the divine presence ends and God's creations begin. In other words, if all goes to plan, this tabernacle is meant to be an opportunity to bring the divine presence more tangibly into this world. But if this parsha is only made up of a list of materials, how is that channeling of God actually meant to take place? What is going to transform this physical apparatus into something much more, into a holy site of sanctity, into a site of sanctuary? So in order to answer this question, we're going to back up just a couple of verses and bringing back to mind our reflections on giving, we turn to the very opening verses of this week's parsha. Vayadaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, and God spoke to Moses, saying, Daber el bnei Yisrael, veyikchu li truma, me'et kol ish asher yidvenu libo, tikchu et trumati. Tell the Israelite people to bring me a truma, to bring me gifts. And you shall accept gifts for me from every person whose heart is so moved. And it's these gifts that will make up the very long list of materials that will go into making the Mishkan. But what's so moving is not that these materials themselves are a truma, an offering or a gift, but it's that they're completely optional. Quote, accept gifts from every person whose heart is so moved. Rabbi Sachs explains that what Truma is teaching us is that the best way of encountering God is to give. And it wasn't the quality of the wood or of the metal or of the drapes, and it wasn't the jewels or the beauty of the architecture or even the smell of the sacrifices. The reason that God felt close to the Israelites is because in the places that people give voluntarily to one another and to holy causes, that is where the divine presence rests. So before we even get to this IKEA list of materials, what our Parsha is telling us above all is that giving freely and generously that which we feel is meaningful and sustainable in the service of others or in the service of God, that is how we channel the divine presence that is not just among us, but even within us. So last night, some of us who are in this room tonight joined together in this very room. And we gathered with our partners at CLU, Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. And we were gathering to acknowledge our our successful fundraiser towards our detained immigrant bond fund. And we heard the stories from two of our immigrant neighbors who had dear family members kidnapped by ICE, and who shared with us the ways that contributions from this bail fund had made significant impact during what had been such a painful and scary past year. And their stories were heartbreaking and deeply infuriating. We heard about inhumane conditions at the detention centers and financial insecurity with the loss of income, and above all, just the inhumanity of loved ones being taken from one another. But as we sat together in this room, something else also took place. People shared what was giving them hope. And we heard from Sasha, our Tikkun organizer, and from Jennifer, a Clue organizer, about the many ways that people have been able to show up and to give their dollars to this bond fund, but also their time as court observers and their physical bodies, providing protective presence so that folks could still go to their sacred spaces and show up to church on Sunday mornings. And just last week, Rabbi Susan and I traveled to Washington, D.C., where we participated in a Jews Against ICE protest in front of ICE's headquarters. And at this rally, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum shared a message that I've really heard speaking to me through this week's Parsha. She said that in this moment, it is definitely easy for so many of us to feel overwhelmed by the severity and the intensity and the incessant nature of the attacks of this regime on our communities and on our loved ones and on our neighbors. And she said it's not our responsibility to fix everything, but it is our responsibility to do something. And so over these last few weeks or months, if you have been feeling a paralysis about how to take action, I want to affirm loudly and clearly that you are not alone. These attacks are meant to paralyze us. They are meant to overwhelm us. And so I want you to return to that feeling of what it feels like to give. And I imagine that many of you felt deeply into feelings of warmth, of love, of connection, of feeling good about yourself, or more connected to another person, and that is okay. Let that be the fuel to take this next step. Not to do everything, but to do something. Earlier tonight, when I shared that the word for dwell, shachan, was from the same shoresh, or the same root for the word mishkan, which means sanctuary, as well as the word for Shekhinah, which means divine presence, I didn't share that there's one other significant word that shares this very same root. This word is shachen or shchena, neighbor. It's with this knowledge that Parshat Trumah's wisdom becomes a real call to action. Because without a mishkan, what we can do in order to feel closer to God, to serve God, to channel the divine, to channel the values and morals of the God we would aspire to believe in, it's incumbent upon us to give whatever we can, whatever feels right, to our shchenim, to our immigrant neighbors, and to create for them a mishkan, a sanctuary that is safe, that is welcoming, that is inclusive, that is unequivocally a place where all of the divine's creations are welcome. And so if you feel ready to take this next step and you still don't quite know how to, please know that this is an invitation. You can approach any of us here on the Nefesh staff. You can show up to our next Tikkun collective meeting led by Sasha. You can ask the folks sitting to your left and to your right tonight, how have they shown up? How have they given of themselves in this moment? Ve'asu li mikdash ve'shachanti betocham. Please, God, may we merit that your divine presence will dwell among us and within us as we continue to build a mishkan, a sanctuary for all who are created in your image. Shabbat shalom.
Comfort to my friends when they're hurting.